Hey, hermeneutics class, this is Chris Dickerson. I want to walk you through the beginning process of writing an exegetical paper. As you know, this class will culminate in a couple of weeks with you writing perhaps your very first ever exegetical paper. So I want to give you kind of the standard of what that looks like, and we have uploaded 2 documents to our Populi class folder that will help you to walk through that. One is called A Short Guide to Writing Exegetical Papers. That was actually originally created by the authors of your textbook, Duvall and Hayes, and then I've modified it to be exactly what we want here at Carolina College of Biblical Studies. Then we also have a paper that was written, an exegetical paper, kind of as a guide. Perhaps that will help you to see the format, and these two kind of parallel each other, hopefully. For the most part, you'll see that in the work that we're going to do. So let's get started and walk through these papers. If you have opened up the short guide to writing exegetical papers, it will look somewhat like this. And so what I want to do today is just kind of walk through a few aspects of it. I trust that you will read it in time. The very first thing that your exegetical paper will include is, of course, the title page. It should be a Turabian 8 title page. You are familiar with that, hopefully. If not, please pick up a copy of Turabian 8, the Chicago Manual Style 16, but it's a shortened form, if you will, for us, is what's called Turabian 8. Notice that the title of your paper, whatever that will be on the first line, and then an exegesis of Ephesians, but for us it'll be 2, 1 through 10. And then, of course, at the bottom in non-bold text will be your name, the course, and the date. That's my birthday, October 24th. So you can always remember that as you look back at this assignment. Anyway, on page 2, which will take up approximately 1 page, you'll see that you should have the main idea and the outline. And if you'll notice here, there's some instructions about what that should include. But here on the next page is kind of a preview of what that would look like for you. You would put the text here, the Ephesians for you, 2, 1 through 10. And then in a single statement, you would summarize the main idea of that passage right here at the very top of the page. And then you're going to outline the passage as you are beginning to learn right now in the portion of the course that you're in, as we dealt with the Ephesians book and we looked at the big outline last week, and now you're looking somewhat at the surrounding context. That's going to help you get to that. And then what you're going to do here, though, is you're going to take your passage, in this case, 3:14 through 21, and you're going to break it down into the separate major sections and give that a title, whatever that would be. And then if you need to subtitle or give some subpoints, you would do that here. These all are complete sentences, complete ideas. Each of them have the verse identified as to where it comes from. And so you want to make sure we're outlining the biblical text, not coming up with some sermon outline. That's later. Hermeneutics is the first step. Homiletics comes in a different course. So this should be a page by itself, the very first page following your title page. And then you always need to include an introduction to any paper. Now, as we say here, you should think about writing your introduction last. I would really reserve about half a page. I would wait until I was completely done writing the entire paper, because that's when you know exactly where you're going, what you're going to say. Then come back and write an introduction. Grab the reader's attention. Tell them a little bit about where you're going. Include the main idea, much like you would a thesis statement. And then that would serve as your introduction to an exegetical paper. Don't just start saying the author is Paul. Who cares that the author is Paul? Tell me what you're writing about. Tell me the main idea. And then begin in the next section on context about who the actual writer is. So here we see the next section, context, is going to take up about 2 pages. And what's going to be in here? Well, there's some explanation here and some examples. But I want you to notice the 2 things I've highlighted in this yellow gold color. Number 1, you begin this part of your paper by describing the historical, cultural context. Hopefully that sounds familiar to you, to a homework assignment you did a couple weeks ago when you described the biblical writer, the biblical audience, the date, the occasion, the theme. Basically, what we did a couple of weeks ago in that historical, cultural context of Ephesians goes in this portion of the paper. Now, I made specific comments and when I graded that assignment. You need to fix those. You need to clean it up. You need to make sure it's well supported and documented with footnotes and citations, etc. And then you basically put that here. And then notice the second highlight, the second thing you need to include is the context section, and there's a paragraph or two about the surrounding context. Well, one of the other assignments you're doing for homework is what's called the surrounding context. You're going to write a paragraph about what goes on before your passage, a paragraph about what goes on after your passage, and then you're going to summarize how those two before and afters affect the meaning of your central passage. That's the essence of what goes here. So you've already written a good portion of all of your paper already in our homework assignments. Excuse me, you've worked on the outline, you've made observations, you begin to think through the main idea. We've already done that in a couple of the first assignments. Historical cultural context, that goes right there. Surrounding context, that goes right there. So you can see how a lot of this is beginning to come together as you clean up some of your homework and put it together for this. Now, the bulk of your paper is this content section. Notice that it's 5 to 8 pages. So your final paper should be anywhere between 9 and 12 pages, not less than that, and preferably not a whole lot longer than that. This content section is the heart of it. This is the heart of your exegetical work. You're saying, here's why I believe the main idea is the main idea. Here's why what this word means. Here's what Paul is doing. Here's how this works. This is the fruit of all of your labor in exegesis and in hermeneutics. So look at what I've highlighted here. This section is the body of your paper and the heart of your exegetical work. Then I'm going to talk a little bit here about how it should look, and then we'll talk about what it should include. So first, you're going to use the main headings of that outline on page 1, and you're going to put those right here as the main subheads in your paper. And then you're going to include the passage of scripture there. You're going to put it in italics and center and make it look pretty. And then you're going to explain everything you need to support that idea. Now, this is an example. It should be much more than 3 sentences. I want you to think if you've got 8 pages and you have 3 subheads, then you're looking at 2 pages each for each of those major sections. So think through that and make sure it's well balanced. Then you're going to skip a single line, and then you're going to put the second subhead, and then you're going to include the scripture passage again for those verses, and make sure those verses are tagged to each subhead so I know exactly where you're coming from. And then again, you're going to start explaining this section, and you're going to work through all of this. Now remember, in the exegetical paper, you're giving the content, the reasoning, the history, the word study, how the meaning comes together, cross-references. You're not preaching the passage. Preaching is another course. Preaching is the fruit of the exegetical paper. It is not the exegetical paper. So here's what it should look like. Now, let's talk next here about what kind of information to include. And again, the main thing you're after is the meaning of the text. If you say that this passage explains why giraffes are bunnies, then you need to show me in the passage what it's saying about giraffes and how it says giraffes are bunnies and what the result of that is. Whatever you say the main idea is of your passage, that's what goes in your exegetical paper. And you're supporting it through evidence and verses and what Paul's trying to argue and other things that are going on in the book and how that impacts your specific passage. So how do you find all this information? Well, here's a few suggestions. Number 1, do the observation work of your passage. Remember this from a couple weeks ago when you sketched out the passage and you thought through what it said and the repetition of words and conjunctions, and you did this diagramming. That comes out here. You're telling that. You're not just copying and pasting it. Don't do that. All of this should be written out in paragraph form, academic style writing, but begin to put that information there. Do the word study. We're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks, and include that information here, how that word study impacts your meaning. And then you're going to go here and consult outside sources, good technical commentaries. Don't use the commentaries that we prohibit. Go back to the lesson a couple of weeks ago where we identified what recommended and prohibited sources are. You shouldn't have Matthew Henry in this paper. No offense to Matthew Henry. I think he did a wonderful job, but his work is devotional. It's the fruit of his study notes and his margins. He wasn't necessarily a scholar. And so his information is not going to help you really dissect an exegetical paper. J. Vernon McGee, same thing. Warren Wiersbe. I love Warren Wiersbe's books, and I read those in preparation to preach because he puts it in everyday language, uses illustrations. But for this level work, you need high quality exegetical technical commentaries that are explaining what the original language meant, what the context was, how all this cross-references to other parts of Scripture. Don't come in here and give fluff. This should be very supported evidence. Every paragraph in this part of your paper should have a footnote. Should reference somebody else who is saying what a word means and how this important, why this is important. I don't mean this in a bad way. Don't take me wrong. I don't care what you know. I only care what you can prove. Prove to me that somebody else said this is what a word means. Don't you tell me what the word means, because you are not the PhD scholar on Greek language, and you're not the PhD scholar in the study of Ephesus. So don't tell me what you think you know. Make sure you cite it. Make sure you support it. Make sure you show the work. Show the research. You also are going to want to identify the theological principles communicated by your passage. You want to organize this roughly one section at a time. Here's a good way to think about it. Opening sentence. Tell me what your paragraph's going to be about. Then explain, support, and then move on to the next paragraph. But every paragraph should have one main idea. Should be somewhere between, 3 to 6. I would even say 5 to 7 sentences long. Shouldn't be much longer than that. If it is, you probably cross the line of too much content in one paragraph. So break up your paragraphs, 2 or 3 paragraphs per page, and do good writing. My challenge is to write it, rewrite it. A few things not to do. Notice them here. Don't try to include everything you've learned. There's going to be something you learned about the city of Ephesus that's going to be important. Include it. There are going to be other things that you learned in your study of Ephesus that are not pertinent to me understanding this passage, so you should not include it. You only have 12 pages. And I know that sounds like a lot until you get ready to do an information dump and tell me everything, and yet at the same time telling me everything, you've not explained to me the main idea. So let's focus on the main idea the whole way, and that'll be good. Number 2, don't preach to the reader. You're writing an exegetical paper, not a sermon. Don't substitute a fluffy illustration or touching testimony for biblical interpretation. This paper is not where that goes. That would be great in the presentation of a sermon, but not in exegetical paper. Don't use phrases like I believe or I think. That doesn't go in exegetical paper. And don't use the illustrations to explain it. Give me evidence, not illustration. Don't lose sight of the goal of explaining the meaning of the text. Tell me why the main idea is whatever you say it is. That's what we're looking for. Don't quote large sections of text from a secondary source. In fact, I would challenge you to not include a block quote at all. Sure, they're helpful from time to time, but what I'd rather see is you interpreting, summarizing, put it into your words what the writer says, footnote it, give them credit, but don't just list a bunch of block quotes. That is poor writing. That's lazy writing. Only if a writer says it in a way that you couldn't say it any better, you couldn't say it more concise, you couldn't say it more clearly, should you quote them. And let's be honest, you can probably say it just as short, just as well, in probably fewer words than they do. Don't put off your writing to the last minute. This is why in this class you have to submit a full exegetical paper by week 9. That way you have time to proof it. Your peers are going to read it, and they're going to proof it, and then you're going to get it back, and then you're going to finesse it, and then at that point you're going to turn it in. This exegetical draft is a full paper, as if it were your final grade, and you will be greatly penalized if you don't submit a full draft. So when an issue is debated by interpreters, don't ignore the debate. Let me give you an example. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 1, the phrase "in Ephesus" is not in every manuscript. You probably should at least acknowledge that, make an explanation of that, and then move on. When you date Ephesians, the date is dependent upon which imprisonment Paul was in. He was in prison 2 or 3 times. Each of those were in different dates. To say that this was written while Paul was in prison is not enough. You need to say, well, I think this was the time when Paul was in prison here, and this is why that is, and here's the date for that. So when there's a disagreement in the interpreters and the commentaries, and you only find that out when you read multiple books, then you're going to make sure we bring that here and then explain the debate, and then make your choice and explain why you picked what you did. In other words, show that you understand the issue, and then make sure that you clarify which stance you're taking, and then as you move on through the paper. And then lastly, application. We've not talked about application, and so in your exegetical draft, this may be a little thin for you, but your last page before your bibliography will be application. Here you're going to do the work as we will teach you in a couple of weeks in chapter 13. But what you're going to do is you're going to identify the basic principles of your passage that were in key to the original context, the original audience. Then you're going to show how that parallels to modern day. And then you're going to make very specific application to the reader or to the modern believer. So if we were doing Paul's text in Corinthians, meat sacrificed to idols, then you would need to explain a little bit about the major elements there. We're talking about believers. We're talking about things that were sacrificed to idol worship and things that made a weaker believer fall in their faith. You then, in section 2, bring that to today, where we're not talking about meat sacrificed to idols, but we might be talking about the use of alcohol and say, well, here's what that meant, and it might mean this, and it might mean this, and here's how that works. Therefore, you should or shouldn't do whatever, and here's how that works in application. So think through that, and then finally wrap it up with very clear and very specific application. Don't just say, read your Bible more. Well, that's great advice, but how? Be specific. Give an example, a concrete example of what they can do. And then finally, on a separate page, there would be a bibliography, formally written, all the sources that you used, all the sources that you cited in your paper. And if you'll go back to the syllabus, you'll know that there are a minimum of 12, and there are a variety of types. You need to include a Bible dictionary. You need to include a course, a New Testament introduction or survey book. You need to include certain types of commentaries, certain amount of word study, all that kind of content you need to work through and include in your bibliography. Now, here's the thing. I'm expecting you to have actually read and cited those sources. Don't just say, whoa, he doesn't know, I'll include these 12. God knows. And so you just remember that. Make sure that you're doing above reproach level of work. Now, let's very quickly look at this sample exegetical paper. You see the titles there? You'd put your name and the course name and the title, the date here. Here's an example of that main idea. So we're talking about Ephesians. Here's our main idea of the text. Here are the major points, and here is the text written out. I think that's helpful. You don't have to do it necessarily that way, but follow this model or the model we saw in our paper here. If we went all the way back here, we'd see we didn't include the text written out, but we did include the subpoints. Here there are more points, so less subpoints, so you might include the passage. That helps me track what you're doing exactly. And then here we go. Here's an introduction. And then notice at the very bottom, they've included the main idea of the text, what we abbreviate oftentimes as the MIT, main idea of the text. Then the next portion, this happens to be a whole page, but wherever this ends, the next section begins, context and situation. So this would be the historical context and the cultural situation, as well as the surrounding context. That goes on for about 2 pages, 2.5 in this case. And so then as we track through here, we get to our content of the passage. And here's that passage section. There's the main heading, as we saw in that outline a few pages back. Notice we have our footnotes here. Notice what we're dealing with, the words and what's going on. Paul uses this word and etc. Similar to Zechariah, he's doing a word, a cross-reference there. We're building off of what scholars like John R.W. Stott have explained. Then we move on to the next one, and then we continue and continue and continue. There's the third main heading and the fourth main heading, and we go on all the way until we're done, and then we would include the conclusion. The only thing I would add to this exegetical paper is a clear application section. So if you remember over here, we had this application. So we need to bring this application section into this paper. Maybe that's the purpose here, is application / conclusion. That's fine. I want to see a clear application in your paper. So therefore I would call it application, not conclusion. And that way there's no question. And then finally, on a separate page, you have your works cited or bibliography, however you want to word that. And then here's the information on how to do that, etc. They should be in alphabetical order, A to Z of the author's last name. There's some helps on our CCBS website, student information, tutorials and on how to do your bibliography. There's also some helpful websites out there that can clarify that. But make sure you have that information there. I'm going to count for 12, but I'm also going to count for what type of commentaries. Did you use the right type of commentaries? Did you use the right kind of sources? Or did you just use some cheap stuff that you found somewhere? By the way, citing basement blogs is not going to work either. Use good scholarly work. You have it available in Logos. There's some on Blue Letter Bible website. You have links in your EBSCO, both to ebooks. There's some great books in EBSCO, like the Tyndale Commentary on the New Testament. There's the IVP Dictionary of Paul and his letters. All of those are available as ebooks through our website, through the EBSCO links page. Then there's journal articles in EBSCO and Galaxy. Go there and do the research and prove yourself a workman who is unashamed. This is our exegetical paper. I know that you need to begin working on it. Hopefully this will give you an idea of where to go, what to do. If you have questions, feel free to email me. I'm always glad to help you the best I can. And good luck on the paper.